So yeah, thanks so much for having me and for inviting me to give a talk today. I was super excited to get the invitation, and I'm really glad that Fiona gave her talk before me because I'm basically gonna give her talk some neuroscientific foundations, because I think my points are almost all the same points, but then coming at it from a neuroscience perspective. So I think that's going to be super interesting to discuss in more detail. Like I said, I am a neuroscientist, I'm not a philosopher. So yeah, I'm probably going to be conceptually sloppy every now and then. Please forgive me and bear with me. And if anything is unclear at any point in the talk, then feel free to interrupt me to ask for clarification. All right, so today this talk is going to be existing of two parts. The first part is the biggest part, and I'm going to be talking about potential ways in which the brain could dissociate perception and imagination. I'll talk about sensory processing, and vividness is going to be a big part of that discussion. Then I'll talk about cognitive control or volition. I'll also mention predictability, and I'll end with sensorimotor contingencies, or what happens when you move your eyes. Can we use that as a way to check whether something is really there or not? And then I will conclude, very much like Fiona did, that there are no clear categorical differences between imagery and perception. None of these factors unambiguously determine whether something is real or imagined. So then in the second part, which is just going to be like 10 minutes or something, I'll talk about the need for a reality monitoring system in the brain that integrates evidence amongst different factors to make decisions about whether something is real or imagined. I'll briefly discuss the relationship between that system and metacognition, and talk about knowing whether something is real versus experiencing it as real, which is maybe a little bit philosophical. So I'm curious what you think about that, and then I'll end with some conclusions and future directions. The biggest part of this, or the main part of this talk, is based on this recent preprint that I wrote together with Peter Koch and Steve Fleming. It's at the moment kind of almost being published, but you can still find the preprint online if you're interested to have a look at this later on. So which cues could a brain use to tell whether any given perceptual or sensory experience is real or imagined? Now, first of all, as Fiona also pointed out, we have this intuitive idea that the phenomenological experience of imagery is less vivid and less clear than that of clear, crisp perception. And this is something that seems to be backed up by neuroevidence. So the way in which the visual system is triggered during imagery and during perception is very different. Specifically, during perception, we get input from the outside world, which is received by the brain, specifically in middle layers of the primary visual cortex, which means that all layers of the primary visual cortex during perception carry information about what is perceived. And this middle layer is important because this is the layer that contains the most excitatory and driving neurons. So this layer really like ramps up activation in the visual system. But during imagery, there's no such associated bottom-up input, and everything instead is top-down driven, which means that there's no activation in this middle layer during imagery. And as a consequence, the total amount of activation in the visual system during imagery is lower, just because that's how the brain works. That's how anatomically it's wired up, that if you only have top-down connections, you cannot get the same strength of sensory activation in general. Of course, there's noise, the brain is a noisy system, so there might be cases where imagery does get too strong there. And this idea and differences in sensory strength is something that's been found time and time again in early fMRI and PET studies. When you just look at amount of brain activation during perception and imagery, then in high-level brain areas, here the interparietal sulcus and the visuum gyrus, this is a coronal slice along the ears. You see that the activation during imagery and perception is very similar in these high-level areas, and these areas code for more like conceptual representations. But then as you move down the visual hierarchy to more low-level visual areas that are responsible for representing the details and the vividness of experience, and during imagery, the activation kind of dies out. There still seems to be something there, but it's a lot less strong than during perception. Looking at multivariate information in brain activity is another way of looking at these systems that's become more popular over the last decade. And it's a way of kind of inferring what somebody is, for example, imagining. So it's about information, not just strength, but like precision or detailedness of the activation. And during perception, there's a lot of information throughout the entire visual system. So low-level early visual areas as well as high-level visual areas contain a lot of information about what somebody is perceiving. And during imagery, this information seems to mostly be present in these high-level areas, although there is still some information in low-level areas. So taking all of this together, could the brain not just say like, okay, well, this sensory signal is very vivid and clear, so it's probably real. Maybe that's the easy way of just doing perceptual reality monitoring, just looking at the total sensory strength of the signal and the amount of information present. And if it's high enough, just if it crosses some threshold, we say it's real, and otherwise we say it's not real. Well, there's a few problems with that. First of all, the way these representations are organized in the brain during imaging perception is very similar. So we can use a classifier, that's how this is analyzed. We can use a classifier trained on perception to decode imagery and the other way around, which means that the format is very similar. Even though the strength generally is different, the way in which these things are represented is very similar throughout the entire visual system. And using more kind of fancy advanced techniques, recent studies have found that there's overlap in neural representations between imagined and perceived stimuli throughout the entire visual system. So the way in which imagined and perceived visual stimuli are represented is very similar. So that poses a challenge for such a simple reality monitoring system. And importantly, something that Fiona also pointed out already is that there are differences in the experience of the imagery vividness. So some people can have very vivid imagery and still know it's not real. And when imagery gets really, really vivid, the underlying neural code also gets more perception-like, which is really interesting. So this is one study that found a correlation between the VVIQ and the cross-decoding accuracy between imagery and perception in early visual cortex, which is a fancy way of saying that the neural representations of perception and of the imagery content was more perception-like when it was more vivid. And we also found this within participants, just different instances of imagery fluctuating over a task, that when people said, okay, now my imagery is really vivid, then their underlying neural representation was more perception-like. So this poses a challenge, because then, when you have very vivid imagery, you get a very similar perception-like neural signal in the sensory areas. And then how can you then do reality monitoring if reality monitoring is only based on sensory strength? That doesn't work. But in most cases of hyperphantasia or very vivid imagery, people still know that it's not real. So they don't suddenly think that they're hallucinating or something like that. No, they don't suddenly start hallucinating. If they think they're hallucinating, they would know it's not real. But yeah. So what other signals could the brain then use instead? Now, one of the things is that people often talk about is volition or cognitive control. Is that when we imagine something, we can kind of choose what to imagine, right? That's at least the intuition that we have. So, for example, when we're decorating our new flat, we can imagine different color pillows on our couch and like try to just simulate different colors as a way to decide what colors pillows we would buy. Whereas during perception, we kind of just have to work with what we got. We just receive what's out there. We don't really have control over what we're seeing during perception. It's just what is there. So then, maybe what we can do is say, okay, I have a lot of control over this signal, so it must be imagined. Easy reality check. Cool. Okay, great. However, during perception, we do have some control over our perceptual processing. For example, we can use feature-based attention to amplify certain signals and decrease certain other signals. And the way that this is implemented in the brain is actually very similar to the way that generating a mental image is implemented in the brain. So we looked at connectivity during imagery and perception. And during imagery, we found that the frontal cortex talks very strongly back towards the visual cortex. And this exact same connection is also increased during perception. So this top-down enhancement of sensory activation, which might underlie the generation of a mental image, might be exactly the same system that is used to use feature-based attention during perception. So if this neural mechanism is very similar, then again, the brain cannot use this signal to dissociate between the two because there's a lot of overlap. Furthermore, there's also another kind of consequence of this cognitive control that might be more useful, which is the predictability. So this is something that is related to the Perky effect, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. So during imagery, we kind of choose what we see, right? So for example, when you want to see a pink elephant, you generate a pink elephant and then you have it, you see it, it's not a surprise. You can fully predict what you're seeing based on your imagery intention. But during perception, things kind of come at you. So, suddenly there can be an eagle coming into your visual space, and then that's unpredictable. So maybe then instead of really the volition signal, what the brain could use is this predictability based on the volition signal. So if something can be fully predicted based on your intention, then it must be imagined. That's another way of looking at it. So this is what has been suggested underlies the Perky effect, which was discovered by Mary Cheese West Perky in her seminal study back in 1910. So just a reminder for people who are not familiar with this work, what she did is she asked her participants to imagine various objects while looking at a certain location of the wall, for example, an apple, and then to describe what they were experiencing. But at the same time, unbeknownst to the participant, Mary Cheese West Perky used this magical lantern, which is the stimulus PC of the early 1900s, to sneakily present congruent colored shapes at exactly the same location in the wall. So this magical lantern was totally hidden for the participants. They had no idea that this was there. And then the question is, did they notice these external stimuli? Well, they didn't. They said things like, if I hadn't known I was imagining, I would have thought it real. So the idea is that these people attributed these external signals to be the cause of their imagery because it was fully in line with what they were imagining. So they were like, oh, my imagery is super vivid. That's interesting, but they never really thought that it might be because it's real. They just always ascribed the signal to their imagery. Now, in a recent set of psychophysics study, we tried to replicate the Perky effect because it's very interesting and it suggests that maybe cognitive control and predictability are a good signal to use for reality monitoring. But it hasn't really been replicated and the sample size was really low and there wasn't a control condition in the Perky experiment. So we should replicate it. So that's what we tried to do using kind of modern techniques. What we did is ask people to imagine great things, which I know is way more boring than apples, but we have more control over great things, so that's handy. So they had to imagine left or right tilted gratings while looking at dynamic noise. So imagining as if the grating appeared within the noise, keeping their eyes open, and then indicating their imagery vividness on a scale from 1 to 5. And they did this in 10 trials in a row. And then on the 10th last trial, unbeknownst to the participants, like what Perky also did in her studies, we presented a stimulus that was either the same or incongruent to the one they were imagining, so perpendicular to the one they were imagining, until about threshold. And then we again asked participants to rate their imagery vividness. So for the participants, from the participants' perspective, this last trial was similar to all the other trials before. But then we asked after this last trial, hey, do you think on the last trial that a real grating was presented, or was anything you saw only the result of your imagination? So this was like a source monitoring question. And if the Perky effect would be replicated, we would expect that in the case of the congruent imagery, when they were imagining the same signal as the one that they were perceiving, they would say that it was imagined because they would ascribe their external signal to be the cause of their imagery, right? Because it would be in line with their imagery intention. Whereas in the incongruent case, that wouldn't be the case because then it wouldn't be in line with the imagery intention, if that makes sense. So we had only one critical trial per participant just to control expectation. And then we tested hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of participants, which is very easy with online data collection. So that was great. Now, this is what we found. So as a reminder, we expect that the percentage of reality judgments during congruent conditions would be lower than during incongruent conditions because it would be ascribed to imagery. And that's exactly not what we found. We found exactly the opposite. So people were more likely to say that they saw a real stimulus when they were also imagining that same stimulus compared to when they were imagining different stimulus, which is exactly opposite to what Perky found. And this was surprising to us. But then when we looked at these vividness ratings for this last trial, what we found was that specifically in the congruent case, when participants said they saw a real stimulus, their imagery vividness was also scored to be higher than when they said they saw an imagined stimulus, or they didn't see a real stimulus, they only imagined the stimulus. So this is again in line with the sensory strength idea that I talked about before, that if an experience is strong or vivid enough, we're more likely to say it's real. So these things seem to like counteract each other in some circumstances. And this idea of imagery being added as sensory evidence is something that we have found now in various different psychophysics studies, showing that when you imagine something at the same time as when you're detecting it, you're more likely to say you see a real stimulus than compared to when you're imagining a different stimulus. And it seems to be adding sensory evidence according to the imagery stimulus. So this is really against this idea that intention is used to explain away sensory input in line with imagery. So in this case, even when you can fully predict your signal based on your imagery intention, you could still say it's real if it's vivid enough. So this also, again, contradicts the idea that this predictability signal is something that the brain always uses. And a final reason against volition or predictability as a way to do reality monitoring is that there are many cases of unintentional imagery. Fiona also mentioned a few of them already. For example, just when we're reading a book, we have these mental images just pop in our mind. We don't have to do anything. Or when we're daydreaming, not all of that is voluntary conscious imagery, right? Some of that is also just rapid streams kind of passing us by. And then exactly the case of PTSD is definitely clearly unintentional involuntary imagery. But in most cases, people still know that this is imagined. They still don't hallucinate, even though it's not predictable based on their intention or volition. So yeah, that is also not a good way of dissociating the two. Then another form of predictability is based on the context or based on our model of the world. For example, when we're high in the mountains, then there are certain things that we would expect to see. And a pink elephant is not one of them, right? This is completely unexpected based on our current context, whereas an eagle is completely suspected based on our current context. You can think of this in similar ways as when you would suddenly see a polar bear in your room. You would be very surprised, and then you might wonder whether your experience is real or whether you are just imagining things. So in that sense, if things are more predictable or more expected, we might be more likely to say they are real instead of imagined. So that's the other way around, actually. And this is something that has been worked at by Roy Solomon and colleagues in recent virtual reality experiments, which is really cool. So they just started a project which is called Unreal, and I definitely recommend following progress on that because I think it's really interesting. So what they're doing is they are using virtual reality to manipulate different kinds of expectations about the world. For example, they change the perspective from which you view the world. In this case, it's as if you suddenly shrunk, as if you're shorter, or as if you grew and you're suddenly taller. So these are ways to violate certain ideas that we have about the external world. And then they check whether people are able to notice these violations and to what extent this manipulates or influences their sense of reality. And what they basically show is that all of these kinds of violations of expectations have a strong effect on how real people perceive this scene to be. So yeah, that's another interesting way of looking at it, that maybe expectation is actually a way that we can think things are more real when they follow our expectations. All right, so that was the part about cognitive control and predictability. I just want to have a brief pause here to check if anybody has any questions, because I think I went through that quite fast. And I'm now going to go towards a bit of a different part of the talk. So just checking if people have any questions.
Any questions?
I have like a philosophical question, but do you want those at the end? Is this just questions of understanding?
Yeah, it might be better to leave those at the end. Great. Okay, great. I mean, if you come up with a question later, that's also fine. I just thought this was a natural kind of pause moment. Cool. Okay, so then another thing that we and others have been thinking about in terms of reality monitoring is moving your eyes. So that sounds very simple, but when you're perceiving something and you move your eyes, then the sensory signals are predictably updated based on your eye movements, right? You see a different part of the visual image and your sensory system actually predicts this in very elegant ways. And like you have this remapping of receptive fields in the sensory cortex and all this stuff, so that the sensory activation changes when you move your eyes, basically. And then during imagery, when you move your eyes, the mental image shouldn't change because there's nothing about what comes into your eyes, right? The mental image is totally internally generated. So this might actually be a super simple way of checking whether something is real or not. Just look around, yeah. And if it doesn't change, then it's imagined. So yeah, that might just be really simple, and we might be looking at this in very complicated ways, but maybe just moving our eyes is the answer to all of our questions. Now, there's quite a strong literature on the role of eye movements in imagery. There's this Tix paper by Coslin and Stephen Coslin and Fred Mast, where they discuss some of the evidence, but this is quite old, and there's been a lot of other studies in the last 20 years. And they find that actually people do move their eyes quite a lot when they imagine stuff. And they move their eyes in similar ways when they imagine something as when they would actually perceive it, which is super interesting. So that could mean one of two things. One of the things is that these eye movements are actually involved in generating mental images, and it's part of the process. And for some reason, that kind of supports generating mental image. The other thing is that it could actually mean that people are consciously doing reality monitoring when they're imagining, and they're moving their eyes just to make sure that their brain knows, hey, this is not real, don't start questioning that this is real, and that's actually online reality monitoring that the brain does. That's a possibility, right? So none of these studies from before dissociated between the two, but there's a very cool study that just came out last year in Neuron that seems to answer some of this stuff. So it's a bit of a complicated design, but I'm going to try to walk you through it, and hopefully it will become clear. So this is a monkey study where they trained monkeys to fixate at a certain location of the visual field or of the screen. And then they presented a banana, of course, in the middle of the screen. And then depending on whether the monkey was fixating on the left or the right of the visual screen, this stimulus is represented in the left or right visual or hemifield of the brain, because if there's contralateral processing, so when it's presented in the middle and the monkey is fixating on the left, then this stimulus is represented in the right hemisphere of the brain. And then what they did is they removed the banana, and then they had the task of the monkey was to remember what was presented and where it was presented. So here they have this imagined representation, which should still be represented in the left hemifield. Yes. And then the monkey has to make a saccade to indicate the location of the stimulus. And then the critical thing, what they did in their swap trials, is they asked the monkey to make a fixational eye movement in the middle of the trial. So here they have the monkey is fixating here, the stimulus presented here. They take the stimulus away, so the stimulus should still be represented in the left hemisphere, left part of the brain, and then the monkey makes an eye movement. So then the question is, what happens to the representation in the brain after the monkey makes an eye movement? If the stimulus was actually here, then the representation should switch from the left hemifield to the right hemifield. But now the question is, because this stimulus is not actually presented, it's imagined, do you actually get this swapping in neural activation as well, as if it was actually real? Right. So again, just a reminder, when something is represented in the right hemifield, it's represented in the left hemisphere. And then when it's taken away and it's only remembered, then it's still contralaterally represented, the imagined stimulus. But then what happens when there's an eye movement and it crosses the midline and it changes the area of the fixation? So these are the hypothesized results. Basically what they're saying, so the activation in the contralateral representation should always be higher than the ipsilateral representation because of the contralateral processing. And if nothing happens to the representation after this swapping, then you would expect this to remain the case even after monkeys make the fixational eye movement towards the opposite side of the hemisphere. But if you do get this swapping, then you would expect a crossover of activation. Now, long story short, what they find is exactly this crossover. So here I'm going to just look at the top panel here. You see that the activation in contralaterally presented trials is higher. That should always be the case because the brain processes contralateral information. And then monkey makes an eye movement towards the other side of the hemifield, and then you see this activation go down all the way to the ipsilateral activation levels. And the opposite pattern emerges for trials that start out ipsilaterally, then it's low, 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 and then after the eye movement, it reaches up to contralateral levels. So this is a visual representation of what they found. Like I said before, when there's during perception, it's represented in the contralateral field. During imagination, this is still the case. And then when there's an eye movement, the representation is remapped towards the other side of the brain. So this means that even when you're imagining stuff, moving your eyes updates the sensory signals in line with these eye movements. So then this is not something the brain can use to do reality monitoring, because the brain doesn't have access to what happens outside the world. The brain only has access to what happens inside the brain. So if the neural signals are actually updated based on these eye movements, then yeah, you cannot make this decision. So taking all of this together, there's these 4 factors that I discussed today, and there seem to be some general differences. So perception is generally leads to stronger sensory processing to imagery, But like me and Fiona also talked about, there are definitely cases of strong imagery that are not confused for reality. And there are cases of weak perception that are also not confused for imagination. So this is also doesn't always work. And then, of course, during imagery, we generally have strong cognitive control, but not always over what we are imagining. And there's also some amount of cognitive control and volition during perception. We can choose what to pay attention to and what not. And in terms of predictability, just in some ways, imagery is more predictable than perception because we know what we're imagining, basically, and we don't know what's out there in the world. But in other ways, perception is more predictable than imagery because what we see kind of matches our internal model of the outside world and it matches our context. Whereas during imagery, we can just imagine things that don't make any sense in the current context at all. And then, yeah, perception follows sensorimotor contingencies. So when we move our eyes, our sensory signals are updated accordingly. But imagery, that also seems to be the case when we're imagining things. So it seems to be that, unfortunately, or I don't know, that's just what it is, none of these factors unambiguously dissociate imagery from perception. So this suggests the need of a reality monitoring system that kind of answers the question, is this the real life or is this just fantasy? Which was, by the way, the title of my grant proposal for the work I'm doing here, which is probably part of why I got it. But so how might such a reality monitoring system work? So one useful concept to think about in this context is the idea of a discriminator, which is a concept that's been used in the context of generative adversarial networks in AI and machine learning, or GANs. You might have heard about them. So I'm not going to explain general adversarial networks, the entire concept to you today, because that's not really necessary. But I think it is a very interesting way of thinking about this kind of idea. So how perceptual reality monitoring can be thought of within this framework has also been discussed by Sam Gershman recently, it's already 3 years ago, in his 2019 Frontiers in Artificial Intelligence paper. So definitely recommend having a look at that if you're interested in this stuff. So the basic idea of generative adversarial networks, or GANs, is that they are trained by having this generative model, which represents how abstract causes are related to sensory input. So it's kind of the internal model that we have of the outside world. And what GANs do is they have this generative model simulate sensory samples from the prior distribution, and then try to fool the discriminator, which is deciding whether any given sensory sample represents the outside world or the internally generated ones. So the generative model is trying to fool the discriminator. So to generate sensory samples that are that good or that are so perception-like or so real-like that they can fool this discriminator. And people have found out that this is a very efficient way of training a generative adversarial network or a Bayesian network to represent the outside world. So within predictive processing, this can be thought of as a very useful and efficient way of training such a system. So within that context, the idea of reality monitoring is an integral or inherent part of doing perceptual processing itself, of generating or of creating an internal generative model of the outside world. So I think this is a very interesting way of looking at it, because it seems that perceptual reality monitoring is something that's kind of a necessary part of having a brain that can predict what our outside world looks like. And this idea is also endorsed by Hak-Wan Lau in his 2019 PsycArXiv paper on consciousness, metacognition, and perceptual reality monitoring. And according to his idea, conscious awareness is about having a higher order representation about the reality of the first order sensory signal. So whether this first order sensory signal reflects reality, imagination, or noise. So according to him, conscious perception is a matter of perceptual reality monitoring. Those are the same things. And reality monitoring is, in this sense, and in the sense of the discriminator, a kind of higher order meta evaluation of first order processes. And because this reality monitoring component also goes together with degrees of confidence, we can be more or less confident in whether something is real or imagined. It is very like a metacognitive process. And there's quite some evidence for the idea that there's a link between metacognition in general and perceptual reality monitoring, or reality monitoring more specifically. For example, in patients with schizophrenia, it has been found that when looking at detection of memories, so whether something really happened before or whether they saw something before or not, patients with schizophrenia have worse metacognition. So they are more confident in false memories and in misses, and less confident in correct rejections and hits compared to healthy participants. So the amount of insight or awareness they have about their own performance is worse. And this relationship between schizophrenia and decreases in metacognition is something that's been found in many different studies. There's a meta-analysis here. So this suggests that maybe, or it gives some maybe circumstantial evidence that reality monitoring as a specific ability relies on similar components as metacognition in general. And then one interesting question is which neural mechanisms might support this reality monitoring metacognitive decision making. And one key brain area that has been suggested is the anterior medial prefrontal cortex. And metacognitive processes have generally been associated with the frontal brain areas, and the reality monitoring of memory. So what I said before, deciding after the fact whether an event has actually happened or was only imagined, has been associated with the anterior medial prefrontal cortex in a wide range of studies. So this is a really cool text paper by John Simmons and colleagues on the neural correlates of reality monitoring of memory, and they implicate this anterior medial prefrontal cortex as kind of a hub of where this system might come together. And then one very interesting example of this kind of findings is the finding that the paracingulate sulcus, which is this fold within the anterior medial prefrontal cortex, correlates with reality monitoring ability. So this fold, when it's larger, it means that there's a larger surface area of the anterior medial prefrontal cortex. So there's more cortex. So it's like a stronger system. When it's absent, then people are worse at reality monitoring. So that's really interesting. So when the fold is absent and there's a smaller surface of anterior medial prefrontal cortex, then people are worse at reality monitoring. And also the length of this sulcus differs between people who have schizophrenia and controls, and then specifically people who experience hallucinations. So people who experience hallucinations have a shorter paracingulate sulcus, so a smaller anterior medial prefrontal cortex, which is very interesting, and it suggests that the same brain area that's involved in reality monitoring of memories might also play a role in actually perceptual reality monitoring, so deciding in the moment whether something is real or not, which is what underlies hallucinations. So taking all of this evidence together, in our paper, we propose that perceptual reality monitoring is implemented in the brain by a hierarchical metacognitive system, where these frontal brain areas, regions, they evaluate first order signals, for example, sensory strength and cognitive control, all of these things that I talked about before are evaluated by this higher order system to make source attributions. And then reality monitoring errors, so mistaking imagination for perception or the other way around, can then arise due to disturbances at different levels of this system. So let me give a more specific example. For example, when because of some disturbances in the visual system, you get hyperactivity when you're imagining something. So for some reason, you get a lot of visual activity when you're imagining something, then you might think it's real, not because there's anything wrong with your source attribution or perceptual reality monitoring system itself, but just because of these first order disturbances. And this might be something that underlies non-clinical hallucinations, because it means that there's generally intact reality monitoring, but there's something wrong with the first order system. Whereas if you have hallucinations because there's something wrong with the reality monitoring system itself, then this might be coupled with delusions, where people are actually making reality monitoring errors in different levels. And this is something that we can start investigating by looking at first order versus second order performance, which is defined by Hakon Lau and Steve Fleming as D prime, which is a perceptual sensitivity measure, or metacognitive D prime, which is how much insight you have about your perceptual performance. So our hypothesis would be that these different kinds of hallucinations or different instances of reality monitoring errors would be associated with differences at different levels of perceptual processing. And this hierarchical system could also maybe start to explain the difference between knowing versus experiencing something as real. So we can do perceptual reality monitoring basically on 2 dimensions. We can experience something as real, and we can know or have the belief that something is real, which is related to the question that was asked before about Fiona, as this laptop that you know is there, you believe is there, but are you actually experiencing it as being there? Kind of. Anyway, but so in the case of perception, general veridical perceptions, these things go together, right? So everything that we see now at the moment, we experience it as being there, as being real, and we also believe and know that it's actually real. And then usually when we imagine something or remember something, then we experience it not as real, and we also know it's not real. But there are cases where these 2 dimensions diverge. For example, lucid dreaming is still generally experienced as very real and lifelike, more so than imagery, but then it's coupled with this kind of insight that it's actually not real. So we suddenly realize that we are dreaming. So we have this background belief or knowledge that is not real. And the Perky effect might actually be explained as a similar case where people experience it as real. Remember, participants literally saying that if they hadn't known they were imagining, they would have thought it real. So the experience seems to be real, but then people do know it's imagined in the case of Perky because they couldn't come up with an alternative explanation because they didn't know this magical lantern was located in the other room. And another really good example is hallucinations with insight. For example, when you're taking drugs and you hallucinate stuff, it might really feel real and you might really have an experience as if those things are really there, but you have this background knowledge that you took drugs, which may make you believe that it's not real. And then hallucinations without insight are reality monitoring errors on both dimensions, where you believe something is real and you also experience it as real, but these are then this is then not true actually. And in our kind of hierarchical perceptual reality monitoring model, these experience dimension might be explained by first order signals, such as the sensory signal strength or the amount of cognitive control. And this knowledge dimension or belief dimension might then be determined by this actual higher order source attribution system, the metacognitive system. So this is all obviously very speculative, but this is how we have been starting to think about these different concepts. So to conclude, I hope to have shown you that although there are general differences between imagery and perception, there's no single factor that unambiguously dissociates the 2. And therefore, reality monitoring might instead be implemented by a higher order metacognitive monitoring system that evaluates these first order signals. And different types of source confusions could then arise due to deficits in different components within this multi-level system, which is something that we can empirically investigate. And one of those questions that we really want to investigate is whether this anterior medial prefrontal cortex or this kind of higher order system is also involved in the actual experience of reality or only in the beliefs or the knowledge of reality. And this is something that would have very important implications for general theories of consciousness, for which some of them, the higher order theories, argue that you need this metacognitive frontal system to actually have any kind of consciousness at all, whereas others argue that this is more of like a belief thing and the actual experience is something that comes from sensory areas. So this would be something that could dissociate between those 2 potentially. And then another interesting question is that in all of these theories about perception, these things are all recurrent. So higher order systems feed back to lower order systems throughout the entire hierarchy. So the question is, does this reality monitoring decision at the highest level also feed back all the way to sensory processing, amplifying initial source errors? So for example, if you wrongly infer that something represents reality, do you then amplify the sensory signal? So this is something that could explain the fact that in different cultures, people experience hallucinations to a different extent. So this is this really cool paper, which anyway, I can't, I made something weird in the animations, but it's a really cool paper by Tanya Luhrmann and colleagues. I can show it later longer, but they showed that in cultures where people generally believe in the presence of spirits and gods, where they think they're more likely to be real, people also experience hallucinations in line with those ideas more often, right? As if these knowledge or these ideas actually influence their actual perceptual experience, which would be in line with a recurrent system of reality monitoring. And then finally, if this reality monitoring is indeed a metacognitive process, could we actually treat reality monitoring errors or delusions by making people better at metacognition? by increasing the accuracy of this high-level monitoring of first-level signals. So that would be super cool if that was the case. And there's many other things that we are looking at the moment, and I'm sure that you also have more ideas to look at, so I'd be keen to hear them. I would like to thank you a lot for your attention and thank specifically Peter Kok and Steve Fleming, who've contributed a lot to these ideas. Thank you.